Is Christianity anti-science, or do scientific discoveries actually point us to God? Well, that is what we are talking about today on the Accessible Apologetics Show. It's my signature show exclusively here on my YouTube channel. It's a show that helps you fast-track your study of key issues for defenders of the faith. Now, if we're just meeting, I'm Dr. Mikel Del Rosario. I'm your apologetics guy. And my guest on the show today is my friend, Dr. Melissa Travis. Melissa is affiliate faculty at the Lee Strobel Center at Colorado Christian University, and she's the author of Science and the Mind of the Maker. This is a book that she uses in her scientific apologetics class. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Dr. Del Rosario. I love I get to call you that now.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Melissa Travis. Melissa and I have been working together for some time. I remember, Melissa, the very first apologetics conference I ever spoke at in Texas, right when I moved to Dallas, was actually one I did with you. And that's the first time we met. So we've been kind of following each other's work for a while, and I'm glad to have you on the show today.
Well, I'm glad to be here. This is going to be fun.
Well, explain to us the title of your book, Science and the Mind of the Maker. That's an allusion to another person's work as well. So tell us a little bit about that.
You're exactly right. It's an allusion to a book entitled The Mind of the Maker, and it was by Dorothy Sayers. And she said, when we experience a work of literary art, there is a pathway of communication that's opened up between our mind and the mind of the author of that work. So she calls the author the maker. So we get a glimpse into the very mind of the maker as we're reading the literary art they've produced. And it struck me how wonderfully that could also be applied to God's creation, and how when we observe all that he has made, and when I say all that he has made, I don't just mean the things we observe out in nature. I also mean when we observe the kind of minds we have as human beings, when we observe the rational faculties that we have, we glimpse a little bit of the mind of our maker. And my great hero, the figure from the scientific revolution that I wrote my dissertation on and who is central to my current book project, is the great Johannes Kepler. And his statement that gets most frequently paraphrased. If someone has never heard but one statement that came out of the pen of Johannes Kepler, it is that when we do science, we're thinking God's thoughts after him, which is central to my entire philosophy of scientific apologetics. But that's the explanation behind the title of my book. I just added science. So it's Science and the Mind of the Maker, so that I could give a nod to the great Dorothy Sayers, one of my other heroes, and also modify it in a way where it can be applied to the world of science and faith.
Yeah, that's awesome. You know, when you think about art, because I'm a songwriter, I'm a musician as well, when you're listening to somebody's song, you're also getting a glimpse into their personal feelings, into their thoughts, into what drives them and their emotions and all that. As somebody who's a podcaster and a content creator on YouTube, you know, God is the ultimate content creator. And think about that. That's pretty cool too. We get to see into the mind of God by the things that he has made. Real quick, if someone were to just ask you in an elevator, you know, at an academic conference or an apologetics conference, going from one floor to the next, what is the maker thesis? That's a phrase you use a lot in your book. What would you say?
The maker thesis is the idea that when we examine the evidence coming out of lots of different scientific disciplines, neuroscience, cosmology, biochemistry, earth sciences, for example, when we examine the evidence coming from all those different places, we see indications that there is an intelligence behind the universe, and that there's something about human beings that's resonant with that intelligence. In other words, this intelligence is one with which we have a kinship on a rational level, because we see the rational underpinnings of the world in all these different places. And we have to ask the question, well, why is it that we have the exact type of cognitive capacities to tap into that and unlock many of the secrets of nature?
Hmm. Well, it's a fascinating concept that you work through in your book, but I'll tell you real quick. Many years ago, I was having lunch with a relative, and this person's kind of a science hobbyist, and so we were at this diner. And first thing he says when he sits down, because he's visiting me in the context of a presentation that I gave at a church. He said, "So I guess you just have to decide what you want to believe, then, right? Science or religion?" And so I said, okay, well, this guy's interested in cosmology. So let's talk about arguments for the existence of God based on scientific things, like let's say the beginning of the universe. So we talk about the Kalam cosmological argument, where it's required that we have to have a first cause, that everything has to have come from something, not from nothing. And well, at the end of the discussion, I thought we were having a great discussion. He ends this discussion by saying, "So I guess you just have to decide what you want to believe then, huh? Science or religion?" I was so deflated. I was like, "Oh no, what am I doing wrong?" That was kind of my first intro into doing scientific apologetics of that conversation. So, how would you respond to someone who thinks that science is anti-Christianity or that Christianity is anti-science?
That is such a huge, complex, and loaded question. Most of the time, if I receive it from someone who's a layperson or who has zero experience in the natural sciences or zero experience with Christianity, the way I respond to that is just to ask them questions. My first question would be, well, what do you mean by that? So what has given you the impression that this is an either or situation? In what areas do you sense a conflict in the claims made by science and the claims made by Christianity? Because if you start answering their question with all these assumptions about where they're coming from with that statement, you're going to get into a lot of trouble, and you're probably going to give them answers that they weren't really looking for. And so it's good to always just start with lots and lots of questions and let them talk for a while first. And then I can go into things like, oh, well, let's talk about the history of the various episodes of tension between the Christian church and the discoveries of science. The Galileo affair, for example, is often a big one that comes to mind with people, even if they know nothing else about the history of science. And then we can go from there. If their issue is, oh, well, I think evolution has completely disproven the reliability of the Genesis creation narrative, then we can talk about that. And that often involves a whole new set of questions about, well, what is it you believe about the Genesis creation narrative? And what is it you believe about evolution? And 9 times out of 10, what you can do is just dig down and get to the philosophical underpinning of the worldview from which they're asking these questions. And oftentimes you can really get their wheels turning just by challenging their worldview on a philosophical level. And you don't even have to be an expert in one of the natural sciences to engage really well. And that's what I always tell my students. If you have no scientific background whatsoever, I want to get you to a place where you feel confident talking about science and faith, regardless of your lack of background in that area, because it can be done, and it can be done very well and very effectively.
Hmm. Yeah, I have a lot of apologists on the show. Whenever I ask, how would you respond to this? And they will come back oftentimes with, what do you mean by that? And we've talked about this on the show before, the famous Columbo tactic by Greg Koukl. It really is a staple that we use in the biz, so to speak. And it's a great piece of advice for anyone. So you don't have to be an expert on everything. First, we need to get clear with what the other person believes, so that, like you said, Melissa, we don't just come with our presuppositions and answer a question they're not even asking. And so that's a great place to start, is some version of what do you mean by that. I'll drop a link to Tactics in the description so people can check that out. That book will revolutionize your spiritual conversations.
Yeah, and I'd also, on that point, like to give a shout out to Mary Jo Sharp, who did an entire Bible study entitled, Why Do You Believe That? And I've taken groups through that study, and it revolutionizes their ability to just have basic conversations in defense of their faith.
I think for some people, they have this unconscious idea of scientism in their minds, where science is the only possible way we can know things. So you can know a scientific fact, but you can't know that God exists or something like that. How do you respond to somebody, or how would you approach somebody who has that mentality when it comes to science and faith?
That's a very good question. And I have to start by saying I come across non-believers as well as believers that have this understanding. And so, of course, one versus the other, they're going to take a different side on which discipline they need to cling to the hardest, right? And that's a whole separate conversation. But when I encounter a skeptic, for example, I'll often say, okay, I want you to imagine living as if the claim you're making is absolutely true. If it is absolutely true that science is the only way by which we can gain knowledge about the world, what does that tell us about value, meaning, purpose, morality? Because none of those things can be discovered in a scientific laboratory. You're not going to find the direction to refrain from torturing people for fun when you look through a microscope, right? And I know that's tongue in cheek, right? But I get them thinking about how expensive scientism as a philosophy actually is. And then I'll also point out the fact that scientism is a self-refuting philosophy, because if you're going to make the claim science is the only way to reliable knowledge about the world, you've just made a statement that cannot be demonstrated through the methods of science. So it can't be true, right? It's self-contradictory, self-refuting. The way I usually describe it is it shoots itself in the foot, or it saws off the branch on which it is sitting. Right. And then we have softer versions of that view. You don't often come across even a hardcore materialist who will hold to this hard scientism. Often it will be a much softer version where they will say, okay, the bedrock truths about reality come from our scientific investigation of the world. However, we can arrive at another plane of truth when we observe what helps human beings to flourish. And when we see things that help human beings flourish, we can call those truth, and we therefore have an obligation to live accordingly. Of course, they end up in the notorious grounding problem for these types of moral and value claims, which is another separate conversation. But all of that to say, my strategy is to get the person who's spouting scientism, even if they don't have that word for it, like many people don't. I start asking them questions. What do they mean? Of course, point out the incoherence of the view, and point out how very, very expensive it is, how it's not a livable worldview.
Yeah, so many places we can go with that. But let me ask you this. Where would you go in a conversation with someone, like say you were at that diner with that relative that I mentioned, and he just feels like you have to decide science or religion, as he put it, what you want to believe, because there's not really scientific evidence for the existence of God. What's your go-to, and how do you unpack that in a understandable way for laypersons?
So probably the way I choose the most, and it's not the way I choose 100% of the time, but the way I choose the most is to literally and figuratively go all the way to the beginning and say, okay, let's talk about some of the pieces of scientific evidence we have that our universe began to exist. So we'll go back to Einstein's theory of relativity and how his theory of relativity implied a universe in which all matter, energy, space, and even time itself had an ultimate beginning in the finite past, and then how that was reinforced, confirmed, supported by the telescopic observations of the great Edwin Hubble, and then some of the evidence that has further supported this idea since that great revolution in physics. And then I bring in the philosophical side of it. Okay, given the scientific evidence that we have that the universe had an ultimate beginning, that time had an ultimate beginning, let's talk about the philosophical reasons why we can't have an eternal past that has led up to this moment. So I use those two things together, the scientific evidence of, and we can use the phrase standard Big Bang model, right? I also like to point out, especially when I'm using the cosmological argument with Christians who are in a place of doubt, Christians who have a child that has walked away from the faith that want to use this line of evidence, I point out to them, look, you don't have to frame this as, oh, the standard Big Bang model has given us all this evidence, because you could just take the philosophical tack to the argument and say something that begins to exist has to have had a cause. Mm-hmm. And we have all this evidence that the universe isn't past eternal. We don't even have to mention Big Bang theory and just go at it from that direction, because there are certain categories of Christians who get really nervous when you start talking about Big Bang cosmology. So I just wanted to point out that the cosmological argument has enormous value, no matter where you fall as a Christian on that very, very broad, complex spectrum of views about the Genesis creation narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for some people, they have this separation in their minds where they say, I'm going to go with the science and forget what the Bible says because this is just an old, outdated book. And others are going to say, I'm going to go with the Bible and forget what science says because it's all a bunch of atheistic naturalists who just hate the Bible. When in fact, sometimes there's a misinterpretation of scripture that doesn't line up with what science is saying, or a misinterpretation of what science is saying, because after all, we get more scientific data every year and science can change. And sometimes there's not really that conflict there. Would you agree?
Oh, I would totally agree. So one of the old adages I like to use is science, when properly understood, will harmonize beautifully with theology when theology is properly understood. Or you could use scriptural interpretation. When scripture is interpreted accurately and science is understood accurately, they're never going to conflict because all truth is God's truth, right? So all of this information that we're trying to get about the natural world using the disciplines of science, that's God revealed through his creation, like the mind of God, the mind of the maker revealed in what he has made. And so we do our best with our finite minds, right? Our imperfect finite minds. But we're also applying imperfect finite minds in our project of interpreting scripture. And so I think it's wonderful that God has given us special revelation and natural revelation to help us understand both spheres of knowledge a lot better than we could have if we only had one or the other.
Now, going back to your book, you had a great illustration that I want you to unpack for us, where you talked about a wooden pegboard and how you talked about how that shows us how pieces of evidence can fit the maker thesis. Unpack that for us.
Okay, so when my boys were toddlers, we had a lot of these wooden pegboard puzzles. And for those out there who are not parents or grandparents and have no idea what I'm talking about, essentially what it is you have this wooden board and it has cutouts of different pictures that fit within the larger picture framework on the board. So when all the pieces are in, you have this really cool scene. Sometimes it's a barnyard and the pieces are the animals or the barn structure or a tree, right? And when you get all the pieces in, you have this charming barnyard scene. But when the pieces are pulled out, all you have is like a little bit of a framework for what the picture is going to be once the pieces are put in. If you look at the pieces each on their own, what's interesting is, for example, you have a cow, and on this piece that has the cow, you're going to see around the edges of the piece some clues about the context in which the cow belongs. So some green grass, some blue sky. You might see a little edge of the red barn on this piece that is really dedicated to the cow. Now, when you put all these pieces into the framework, the pegboard framework, what happens is all those little edges that were implying the context all of a sudden make total sense. And when you put them all in, you have this coherent picture that gives you all the answers to the puzzle question, right? What is this picture going to be? Mm-hmm. Now you know the pieces fit in perfectly. They make sense of the context. Now, I use that as an analogy for the intersection of science and faith, because if we treat each of the different scientific disciplines, and to name a few, cosmology, biochemistry, earth science, neuroscience, for example, if we treat each one of those like one of these pegboard puzzle pieces, when we examine each on its own merit, we see these clues. We see these clues that imply a transcendent intelligence behind the universe, no matter which of these disciplines we're looking at, which is really amazing because some of these disciplines don't overlap with one another in their subject matter. So you're looking at this piece, say cosmology, and you're seeing these clues. Oh, the finitude of the universe and the necessity of a cause of the beginning of the universe. So that's sort of pointing you beyond the science. It's raising you to the level of philosophical questions about what the science is implying. Okay, so then you snap that piece and all these other pieces into the framework, you have coherence and you have a rich, full picture of reality. Alistair McGrath will often use this phrase, a richer picture of reality. And I love that because I think it's a perfect description of what happens. Now, by contrast, when you're coming from the framework of materialism, the pieces, you might be able to force them in somewhat, but those edges, the context, these hints that you're getting about each one of these pieces doesn't create a coherent picture when you've sort of forced all those pieces into that materialist framework. In other words, you end up with some contradictions and you end up with some huge unanswered questions because the Christian worldview, the theistic worldview, let me rephrase it that way. The theistic worldview gives a much more intellectually satisfying explanation of reality than materialism will ever be able to provide. There are really important questions about human existence at both a material level and a philosophical level that materialism doesn't have the tools to engage with. I'm not saying this is a situation where science hasn't figured it out yet. Mm-hmm. I'm saying something completely different. What I'm saying is materialist science, okay, doesn't have the tools and won't ever have the tools to answer questions such as, what is our moral obligation as a human being? Just to give you an example, what is the purpose of my life? Materialism is never going to give us that. Mm-hmm. So why would we choose a worldview that doesn't satisfy us on an intellectual level and on a spiritual level, to use the word spiritual in the more generic sense of the word? We as human creatures, we have to have meaning and purpose to flourish. I mean, no one would disagree with that. We have to have that. So why would you choose a worldview in which those concepts really don't have ultimate meaning. When you can have a worldview that makes sense of everything and gives you the icing on the cake for a meaningful life in which you can flourish, because these things are real. Meaning, purpose, value, morality, those are real things within the theistic worldview.
Yeah, we really get a great worldview fit, don't we, when you think about the Christian faith and everything that the Christian worldview implies, not just in areas of faith, but also in all areas of life. Hey, if you're watching this right now and you're getting some value, please hit that like button and share this interview with somebody who needs to hear this today. Melissa, how does the way science explain how natural phenomenon works? Some people feel like that takes away from the idea of the existence of God, because we can explain how science explains how certain natural phenomenon works. Do you see that taking away from the maker thesis? How do you see that?
Oh, not at all. I think the more we learn about the universe, about how things work, about natural law, the stronger the maker thesis actually is. And you have to read the book to understand my full argument for why I'm saying that. But there is a huge difference, a categorical difference between understanding the mechanics of something, understanding absolutely everything about how it works, and understanding, well, what was its ultimate origin? And I'm not talking about, oh, was there any sort of gradualistic evolutionary history behind this thing that I'm inquiring about? I'm talking about even before that could ever get started theoretically, right?
Mm-hmm.
So ultimate origins, like let's talk about the ultimate origins of the cosmos. Knowing everything there is to know, which we will never achieve that in the world of science. Knowing everything there is to know about the physics of the cosmos is going to tell us absolutely nothing about its ultimate origin. It will also tell us absolutely nothing about why the cosmos is rational. Like, why is it structured in a beautifully mathematically rational way? And it also can't tell us things like, why is it that we can turn around and then decipher the rationality that underpins the universe? So all of that to say, no, we can learn more and more and more about how things work, maybe how they've developed, and that does nothing to diminish the maker thesis argument.
Yeah, I always like to say that evolution is a story about how life changed, but I'm most interested in where life came from.
Right.
And so let's just table that for a minute and let's talk about, where did life come from? Where did our minds come from? You know, can consciousness come from non-consciousness? Has that ever been observed anywhere? And so, yeah, it's a fascinating area, and it's a place that people don't often go and think about, because they're kind of afraid that, I don't have the science background for it. But some of these philosophical things, like you're talking about, I don't have to be an expert on evolutionary biology to talk to somebody about, does something come from nothing? Does consciousness come from non-consciousness? And what's a better explanation of how we experience the world? Theism, the idea that God exists, or just materialism, where at the end of the day, everything is just fully explainable by matter behaving according to law. Is that really satisfying? Is that really what we see when we look at the universe? And you gave a wonderful illustration of what we call the fine-tuning argument. You gave a wonderful illustration of fine-tuning, where someone got a bonus at work and they wanted to buy a car. Unpack that for us, because I think that's a great illustration. It's something that would be very helpful to bring up in a conversation.
Sure. Thank you for asking about that. I think it's fun. I spent quite a lot of time constructing this imaginary thought experiment, and it turns out that my students love it. So I'm pretty proud of this little illustration, and I'm not going to read it out loud word for word, but I need to just check a couple details because I can't memorize a number.
That's okay. Yeah, there's a very specific number that Melissa wrote in the book. And while she's looking up the page here, I'll just tell you that I thought it was pretty cool, because a lot of fine-tuning argument illustrations are really complicated. And it's like, I don't know if that really helped the student more than not explaining it. So, but this was great. Right. Please share.
Okay, so my little preliminary remark about this is that my husband is a technician in the ultra luxury sports car industry. He just recently started a job as a Lamborghini technician. So he's in a shop with all these amazing machines, right? So he's been in the automotive industry for 21 years. So cars come to my mind anytime I'm trying to develop an analogy for something. So this was so much fun to develop. And I have found by taking this for a test drive, unintended, that students get it. It makes sense to them. And then they go on and they use this analogy I've developed in their apologetics conversation. So the way the analogy goes is that you have this Mr. Jackson who has just made partner at his big firm. And in that event, he's being awarded this big partnership bonus that's a percentage of his past history with the company. And so this big bonus check that he gets on the day of his promotion is $71,369.21. Okay. Because like I said, it's a percentage based on work performance. So he calls his wife. He's so excited, tells her the amount of the check. And she says, honey, since this is a huge financial windfall that we did not expect, I want you to go down to the car dealership and I want you to buy that dream sports car that you've had your eye on for years and years and years. So he's in disbelief and delighted that he gets to go and buy the car of his dreams. So he goes to the dealership and he walks in and they lead him to this car that's on the showroom floor. And it turns out to be exactly the make and model and color that he wanted in his dream car. But it goes beyond that. So he opens the door, he gets inside the car. The seat is adjusted exactly right for his size. And the temperature is set to the exact degrees setting that he likes to keep his home and office. And the playlist playing on the sound system has every single one of his favorite songs. And when the navigation screen lights up, it's already cued with a map that shows the path to get him from the dealership to his home driveway. Right. And then there's a cup holder that's exactly right because he's left-handed. And all of these things about this car are super tailor-made for Mr. Jackson. He says, I will take it. This is amazing. So they go, they write up all the paperwork, and they give him the final total with taxes and fees and everything. And the total comes to $71,369.21. So then the question that you ask about all of these circumstances surrounding his car purchase is, would it be reasonable to think that all of that was by sheer blind chance? And so in the same way, when we look at all of the parameters of our universe that are finely tuned for the existence of life and further finely tuned for the existence of complex, intelligent life, we're looking at a very similar situation. We ask the question, is it reasonable to conclude that there was no intelligent engineering behind this? And so what I hope I show through the analogy with Mr. Jackson in the sports car is that we would actually be irrational to think that all of that just happened exactly the right way. Right. So just fun stuff.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I love that. Okay, so I have to ask you this. Richard Dawkins once said we can give the possibility of an extravagant explanation for the existence of the universe, not God, as long as the chances don't exceed something like 100 billion to 1 or something like that. Why is it that some people would rather say, well, there's a tiny, ridiculously infinitesimal chance that this was all coincidence, And let's just go with that instead of giving any time of day to the maker thesis or to the idea of God.
Well, that dovetails beautifully with the comment I just made about asking the question, how rational is it given these clear improbabilities that we're dealing with, right? And so when you have someone that says, if there's an infinitesimal chance that this could have happened materialistically with no intelligence involved behind the scenes, if you will, then what they're doing is they're tipping their hand and they're showing just a hard commitment to the materialist philosophy, right? They're not showing an openness to consider the involvement of a higher intelligence.
And arguably there's something else behind there than just looking at raw scientific data.
Right. There's a philosophical commitment there.
That's right. Well, hey, if you're watching this question of the day, what is the number one science question you get when talking about your faith? Drop that in the comments and your question may get featured in a future video. Well, Melissa, is there anything else you'd like to say about this whole idea of putting together science and Christianity and sharing what we believe with others?
Well, what I would say is that in my mind, the most powerful argument we really have for design, intelligent design behind the universe is the fact that science exists. And in the book, I devote a couple chapters to the parts of this argument I'm referring. I guess you could call it, and this has never been formalized in any way in my writing or anyone else's writing that I know of, an argument from the existence of science. Because when we consider the things that have to be the case in order for science to even exist, it defies a materialist explanation. And so we could talk about human reason and all the problems that are introduced when you try to explain human rationality from a materialist perspective. Then we could talk about how mathematics applies so beautifully and precisely to the natural world. And then we have to talk about how the human cognition is advanced enough to do some of this crazy, complicated mathematics involved with fields like theoretical physics, right? So we have all these moving parts that have to be true. Nature has to have an underlying rationality. We have to have a system of mathematics that works to help us understand it. And we have to have minds that can do that work. So the fact that science can even exist is very, very much, in my mind, in favor of a theistic explanation for the universe. But it goes beyond, hey, there has to be a designer behind all of these things that we're observing. It goes even further than that. And I think we can even argue from this natural revelation that we have an intellectual kinship with that intelligence, which is directly linked to the doctrine of the imago Dei, or being made in the image of God. So I think natural revelation can give us all of that, right? So it gets us a step beyond basic theism, in my way of seeing it. It gets us to theism plus a God with whom we have this intellectual resonance.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that, Melissa. One thing that's come out of our conversation today is that Christianity isn't at odds with science itself, but the Christianity, which includes what you call the maker thesis, actually helps us explain more of what we know about the universe versus the worldview of materialism or a world without God. And if you're watching this, I want you to check out a full-length presentation of somebody who has been quite important to Melissa and I in our thinking and our development of thinking about science and Christianity and defending the faith, who is Dr. J.P. Moreland. He has a full-length presentation called Christianity and the Nature of Science. So I'll drop a link in the description so that you can check that out as well. Melissa, thanks so much for being on the show.
Oh, you're welcome. This was a great pleasure.
Thank you so much. And I hope that you will join us again next time here on the Accessible Apologetics Show. I'm Dr. Mikel Del Rosario. I'm your apologetics guy. And until next time, keep the faith.